Let me tell you something about China that most Western financial analysts are either too distracted to notice or too polite to say directly. China represents the last major untapped financial frontier on the planet. Not because it is underdeveloped, it is not. Not because its people lack savings, they save at extraordinary rates that would make most Western economists envious. China represents the last frontier because it has accumulated a form of financial capacity that the rest of the developed world has already spent, the ability to absorb significantly more debt. And America has noticed. In fact, America has built a strategy around it. Before we get into that strategy, and it is genuinely sophisticated, built across multiple layers involving digital currency, geopolitical repositioning, semiconductor access, and manufacturing integration, I want to make sure we establish the foundational concepts that make everything else make sense. Because this is not a conversation about headlines or diplomatic photo opportunities. This is a conversation about the underlying architecture of how global financial power actually moves. And if you do not understand a few basic mechanics, the grand bargain being assembled right now looks like random noise instead of the coordinated design it actually is. So let us start at the beginning. Let us start with how money actually works. Here is something that surprises most people when they first encounter it properly. Banks do not lend out the money their depositors put in. They create new money every time they issue a loan, and the deposit stays on the books simultaneously. Let me walk through this concretely. Say you deposit $1 million at a bank. The bank wants to earn a return, so it loans that same $1 million to a restaurant entrepreneur who is expanding her business. Common sense would suggest that the bank now has zero in its accounts. It gave away what it received. But that is not what happens. The bank still holds your million on its books as a deposit liability, and it also records the loan it just made as an asset. $2 million of financial claims now exist, where $1 million of actual money existed before. The bank created the second million through the act of lending. This seems like magic. It is actually accounting, specifically the system of double-entry bookkeeping that merchant alliances developed centuries ago when traders needed a way to conduct commerce without physically transporting gold across dangerous sea routes. The original problem was practical. Gold is heavy, gold is valuable, and historically the ocean was full of people willing to separate merchants from both. So trading networks developed paper receipts, instruments that promised gold upon redemption, that could be carried instead of the metal itself. Someone had to track what was owed and what was owned. That tracking system, assets on one side, liabilities on the other, became the foundation of modern banking. And the accounting convention that allows banks to record loans as assets while simultaneously maintaining deposits as liabilities is what allows financial systems to expand the money supply far beyond the base of physical assets they originally held. This is not fraud. It is the design feature of modern banking, and it is why economies can grow faster than the physical supply of gold or silver would allow. But it is also why the system requires constant management, because money created through lending is money that must eventually be repaid, and the gap between what exists on paper and what exists in reality is always larger than anyone outside the system realizes. Now apply this logic to a sovereign government, and specifically to the government that issues the world's reserve currency. The Federal Reserve is, at its structural core, a coordinated arrangement among private banking institutions that provides the United States government with a centralized mechanism for borrowing. When the government needs money, for military operations, social programs, infrastructure, or any of the hundreds of other things governments spend money on, it issues bonds called Treasury securities. The Federal Reserve and the banking system it represents purchase those bonds, effectively creating new money and transferring it to the government in exchange for a promise of future repayment plus interest. This system has financed everything that made America the dominant power of the 20th century. It also produced $39 trillion of accumulated debt. At current interest rates around 5%, the annual interest burden on that debt approaches $2 trillion, money the government must raise through additional borrowing, since it cannot generate that level of revenue through taxation alone without severe political consequences. The system sustains itself as long as enough buyers exist for Treasury securities. Historically, those buyers have included foreign governments, China, Japan, the United Kingdom, sovereign wealth funds, institutional investors, and the Federal Reserve itself. But each of these categories has limits. Foreign governments hold what they can afford to hold without creating their own domestic imbalances. Institutional investors allocate based on risk and return comparisons with other assets. The Federal Reserve cannot purchase indefinitely without producing inflation. The logical solution to a debt that keeps growing faster than the buyer base that absorbs it, find a new category of buyer. Specifically, find the largest pool of untapped savings in the world and create a mechanism to route those savings toward American government debt. That pool is China, and the mechanism being built to access it is called the stablecoin. To understand why China represents such an extraordinary opportunity from an American financial perspective, you need to look at one specific comparison: foreign investment relative to economic size. Every major developed economy, Japan, the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, has extensive investment abroad. Their financial institutions own assets in other countries. Their corporations have built global operations. Their sovereign funds hold international portfolios. When you look at foreign assets relative to domestic economic output, these countries are deeply integrated into the global financial system. China, by contrast, has almost no foreign investment relative to its economic size. And remarkably, its international investment footprint is comparable to countries like India, while nations like Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, economies significantly smaller than China, actually have larger international investment positions. Indonesia, Turkey, and Mexico invest more abroad than China does. This creates an anomaly. The second largest economy in the world is operating with a financial profile that resembles a developing nation rather than a global superpower. Why? The answer is capital controls. China maintains a closed capital account, meaning that Chinese citizens and institutions cannot freely convert Chinese currency into foreign currency and move it abroad. The reason for these controls is not mysterious. The Chinese government knows that if it opened the capital account, domestic savings would rush toward dollar-denominated assets, which would create massive downward pressure on the currency, which could trigger the kind of financial crisis that has destroyed other emerging economies that liberalized their capital accounts too quickly. So China sits with an enormous pool of domestic savings, a household savings rate approaching 40%, that cannot easily flow into international assets. From an American financial perspective, this looks like the last great untapped reservoir in the global system. The question is, how do you access it without waiting for China to liberalize its capital account, which China has strong reasons not to do? The answer is stablecoins. Here is the part that is most important to understand clearly, because it explains why the stablecoin strategy is not simply about finding new buyers for treasury securities at current prices. $39 trillion of debt at 5% interest is mathematically unsustainable. There is no realistic scenario in which the United States grows its economy fast enough at sufficient tax rates to service that debt through conventional means. The debt will not be repaid in any straightforward sense. It will be managed through a process economists call financial repression. Financial repression works through inflation and artificially suppressed interest rates operating together over a long time horizon. If treasury yields are pushed down towards zero, through regulatory requirements, through mandated purchases, through the kind of structured demand that stablecoin legislation creates, then the real return on holding U.S. treasuries becomes negative after accounting for inflation. Holders are effectively being taxed through the erosion of their purchasing power. The value of the outstanding debt declines in real terms over decades, not through formal default, but through the steady debasement of what those dollars can buy. For a Chinese household choosing between holding Chinese yuan at 5% or holding dollar stablecoins at effectively zero, the preference for the dollar instrument reflects the perceived safety and convertibility of dollar assets, not a sophisticated analysis of real returns. That preference is what makes financial repression viable. The buyer base can be expanded and interest rates can be suppressed simultaneously as long as sufficient demand exists from buyers who value dollar exposure above yield. Over a 50-year horizon, the debt's real value can be reduced substantially through this mechanism without the political crisis that explicit default would produce. The buyers of treasury securities absorb the loss gradually through inflation in a way that is not visible in any single year's economic data. This is the mechanism. It is not new. Versions of it have been used by governments throughout modern history. What is new is the digital infrastructure that makes it possible to deploy it at the scale of Chinese household savings. The financial strategy is not operating in isolation. Parallel to the economic architecture, there are three geopolitical repositioning moves that create the conditions under which China would find it rational to accept the financial arrangement being offered. The first is Taiwan. For decades, American support for Taiwan has been framed as a commitment to democratic self-determination. In strategic terms, it is actually about geography. Taiwan sits within the first island chain, the arc of islands that runs from Japan through the Philippines, and its strategic position means that whoever controls it can project significant influence over maritime access to the Western Pacific. But consider what happens if Taiwan were to reunify with China. The geography that currently constrains China's naval access to the Pacific would now be controlled by Beijing. Japan and South Korea, whose energy supplies transit through sea lanes in the region, would face a strategic environment in which China could effectively limit their access to the global economy. Neither Japan nor South Korea would accept that outcome. They would move rapidly toward their own defense arrangements. What this means from an American strategic standpoint is that the Taiwan issue, rather than being a direct American liability, becomes a card that transfers responsibility and leverage to American allies. By suggesting openness to Taiwan's return to Chinese sovereignty, Washington does not lose influence in the region. It creates a situation where Japan and South Korea have powerful, independent incentives to resist Chinese maritime expansion, effectively outsourcing part of the containment effort. The American commitment to Taiwan is simultaneously a bargaining chip with Beijing and a tool for activating allied self-interest in regional stability. The second geopolitical piece is South American energy. China's energy requirements are enormous and growing. Historically, China has sought to diversify its energy supply across multiple sources: the Middle East, Russia, and increasingly South America. If the Middle East is unstable and Russia cannot fully meet Chinese requirements at acceptable prices, South America becomes critical. American strategic positioning in South America, the signal sent by announcements about Venezuela and other resource-rich nations, creates a situation where China's access to Western Hemisphere energy is subject to American influence. From China's perspective, however, this is not necessarily threatening. China's priority in energy is stability and predictable pricing, not the specific identity of the government it negotiates with. A unified American presence in the Western Hemisphere that can guarantee stable supply at predictable prices may actually be preferable to the current fragmented landscape of multiple governments, some of which are politically volatile. The control of energy supply that American positioning offers China is, paradoxically, something China might welcome rather than resist. The third piece is artificial intelligence and semiconductors. NVIDIA's Jensen Huang was not supposed to be on the plane to China. Then, at an Alaska refueling stop, he boarded. This is how business negotiations signal breakthroughs, not through press releases, but through the last-minute addition of the one person whose presence means the deal the other side most wants is now on the table. To understand why semiconductor access is central to the grand bargain, you need to understand why China cannot simply develop its own chip industry and become self-sufficient. The answer is not a matter of willpower or investment. China has invested enormously. The answer is supply chain structure. Modern semiconductor manufacturing is not a product that one nation produces. It is a global process. Design happens primarily in California. Fabrication at the cutting edge of performance happens primarily in Taiwan. Assembly and testing and value-added processing is distributed across Southeast Asia. The raw materials required come from Africa, South America, and Australia. The equipment used in fabrication comes from the Netherlands, Japan, and the United States. No single nation controls more than one or two segments of this chain. Any nation trying to replicate the entire chain domestically would need to simultaneously develop expertise across every segment, attract the specialized talent each segment requires, build the equipment manufacturing capacity that currently does not exist outside its current locations, and do all of this while the global supply chain continues advancing at a pace that makes catching up increasingly difficult. The complexity is not additive. It is multiplicative. What this means is that as long as America maintains influence over the trade networks that connect these supply chain segments, semiconductor advantage follows automatically. The choke points are distributed across allied nations, creating a coalition of mutual dependency that no single nation can replicate or circumvent. For China, semiconductor access is not a matter of national dignity. It is a practical requirement for AI development, manufacturing advancement, and economic competitiveness. Access to NVIDIA's chips is more valuable than the theoretical independence that would come from a domestic alternative that does not yet exist and may not exist for a decade. From America's perspective, providing chip access is not a strategic concession. It is a tool for integration, for creating a relationship in which China's AI development remains connected to American technology infrastructure in ways that preserve American visibility into how that technology is being used. And here is the dimension of that relationship that is rarely discussed publicly: the data. China has a population of 1.4 billion people with limited privacy protections and extensive digital connectivity. The AI systems that analyze human behavior at scale require enormous amounts of training data. American technology, trained on Chinese behavioral data, advances in ways that cannot be replicated in environments with stronger privacy protections. The partnership is not a concession. It is a laboratory arrangement. Having established all the pieces of the American offer, the natural question is, why would China accept it? The answer requires setting aside the language of sovereignty and morality. Not because those things do not exist, but because they do not explain how governments actually make decisions when the stakes are high enough. Governments behave according to their interests. China's interests in this negotiation are specific and concrete. China wants reliable access to energy from the Western Hemisphere at stable and predictable prices. It wants semiconductor access to fuel its AI development, and it wants access to American consumer markets for its manufacturing output. These are the three things that matter to Chinese strategic planners above everything else. America can offer all three. The energy access comes through a Western Hemisphere where American influence creates stability and predictability. The semiconductor access comes through the NVIDIA relationship and the policy decisions around chip export controls. The market access comes through the trade relationship itself. In exchange, America wants access to Chinese financial markets. Specifically, it wants Chinese household savings to flow into dollar-denominated instruments that support U.S. Treasury demand. It wants continued Chinese manufacturing that keeps consumer prices manageable for American households. And it wants partnership in AI development that keeps Chinese technology integrated with American infrastructure rather than developing as a parallel, competing system. This is a bargain. Both sides get something substantial. Both sides give up something they would prefer to keep. That is what a negotiated settlement between major powers looks like. The financial dimension, Chinese savings flowing toward American debt instruments through stablecoin infrastructure, is the piece that Western commentary has most consistently underestimated. It is not incidental to the relationship being constructed. It is the mechanism through which American debt becomes manageable without the political pain of austerity or the market disruption of explicit default. Chinese savings, channeled through digital currency infrastructure, absorb the cost gradually over decades in a way that is visible in real return calculations but invisible in headline economic data. There is one additional element that fits into the overall framework but has been treated primarily as a political eccentricity rather than a strategic move: American interest in Venezuela and Western Hemisphere manufacturing development. Venezuela sits on some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. It also has a collapsed economic infrastructure, a dysfunctional political system, and a workforce that needs employment. From an American strategic perspective, Venezuelan resources combined with Chinese manufacturing expertise and American market access creates a triangular arrangement of mutual interest. Chinese manufacturing is productive, cost competitive, and organized around supply chains that do not currently exist in the Western Hemisphere at comparable scale. American consumers benefit from the price efficiency that Chinese manufacturing provides. American policy priorities increasingly require manufacturing that is geographically closer than coastal China. The solution the strategic framework points toward: Chinese manufacturing moving into the Western Hemisphere, into Venezuela, and similar resource-rich locations, where it can process local resources, employ local labor, at terms that Chinese firms know how to organize and export to American markets at logistics costs that are competitive with trans-Pacific shipping. America does not want to do this work itself. The capital investment requirements are substantial, the labor conditions required are not compatible with American labor standards, and the management expertise for this kind of frontier manufacturing development does not exist in American firms at the required scale. Chinese firms have done exactly this kind of work across Africa and Southeast Asia for decades. They are capable of it in ways that no other industrial nation currently is. Venezuela, under American strategic influence providing security and market access, with Chinese manufacturing capital providing operational expertise and investment, becomes a resource processing and manufacturing hub that serves all three parties' interests simultaneously. America gets hemispheric manufacturing. China gets resource access and manufacturing opportunities. Venezuela gets development that its government has been unable to generate domestically. This framework generates several predictions that we will be able to evaluate in the near term. The stablecoin legislation, the Genius Act, and the Clarity Act will either pass in forms that mandate treasury backing and create the distribution infrastructure that reaches Chinese consumers, or it will not. If it passes as designed, the financial mechanism is in place. If it stalls or is modified significantly, the debt management strategy needs a different vehicle. The Taiwan repositioning will either be confirmed through formal or informal signals that reduce American military commitment to Taiwanese independence, or it will not. The NVIDIA addition to the diplomatic mission was a signal in this direction. Follow-on semiconductor access decisions will either confirm or reverse that signal. The Western Hemisphere manufacturing arrangement will either materialize through Chinese investment in Venezuela and similar locations under American strategic umbrella, or the geopolitical friction will prevent it. This is the piece with the longest timeline and the most execution risk. The overall framework is coherent. Whether it is successfully executed depends on whether both sides can navigate the domestic political constraints that make each element of the bargain politically uncomfortable for someone's constituency. America's difficulty is selling a deal that looks like debt to China to an American public that frames China as an adversary. China's difficulty is accepting financial integration with American institutions in ways that reduce the capital account protection that Chinese policymakers regard as essential to domestic financial stability. Both sides have strong incentives to find solutions to those political challenges. $39 trillion of American debt and 40% Chinese savings rates create a gravitational pull toward each other that is difficult for politics to permanently resist. The negotiations happening right now, in Alaska refueling stops, in Seoul hotel rooms, in Beijing meeting halls, are working out the details of an arrangement whose basic contours are already visible if you know what to look for. By the time the headlines describe what happened, the architecture will already have been built. That is how grand bargains work. Not in dramatic announcements, but in the accumulation of smaller signals that only make sense as a pattern when you step back far enough to see the whole design. We will know in the coming weeks whether the pieces fall into place. Watch the stablecoin legislation. Watch the semiconductor export decisions. Watch the energy positioning in South America. Watch whether Taiwan rhetoric continues shifting in the direction it has been moving. The answers are in those details. And those details are worth more attention than the press conferences designed to distract you from them.